Since this is the last of the chamber works of Brahms that I'll be examining in this series, it's altogether fitting that we end with a middle period composition that is widely acknowledged to be his chamber music masterpiece. As is often the case with Brahms's best works, the ghosts of Beethoven, Schubert, and Schumann loom large. Brahms is sometimes described as the composer who best collected all the musical threads then current and braided them into something summary and perfected. No work illustrates that better than his F minor piano quintet, the only music Brahms wrote in this genre, composed in 1864 when he was 31 years old. No other work from this composer has a higher specific gravity, and in no other is the expression, almost all of it dark, so unified. The work's four movements follow the usual symphonic pattern: a large-scale sonata-form opening movement in F minor, a pastoral-sounding second movement in the relative key, a hair-raising scherzo in the minor dominant, and a complex finale in the tonic key. I'll be taking up the movements individually as usual, as you enjoy this recording by members of the Berlin Philharmonic Octet with pianist Werner Haas, available on the Philips label. Movement 1 is a colossus, over 15 minutes long. Its solemn F minor first theme is sounded by three of the players in three parallel octaves. Its continuation, beyond its half-cadential fermata, begins with a furious-sounding eruption. This alternation between tragedy and outrage will be a regular feature of this composition. The second group is presented at the submediant level, first in C-sharp minor, then in its enharmonic parallel, D-flat major. The exposition is repeated. It's in the development section that we really sense the guiding hand of Beethoven. This great cathedral-like structure calls to mind the parallel passages from the opening movements of that earlier composer's Eroica Symphony and Fourth Piano Concerto. The recapitulation is eased into, and the first theme is subjected to considerable reworking, resulting in a transition that begins a perfect fifth lower than during the exposition, which leads analogously to a second group that begins in F-sharp minor. That tonal position is soon abandoned, and the music relaxes by a half step into the home key to finish regularly. Be sure to notice the reassignments. The coda is in two parts, representing the major and minor modalities of F, respectively, and the ending is vehement. Movement 2 is an A-flat major haven in the storm. The movement is laid out in ABA form, its A section comprised of 3 rhymed 8-bar couplets, the third reduced by compression, and some tender closing material. The counterpoint in this section reminds me very much of any number of works by Johann Sebastian Bach. The B section, set in the flat submediant, inharmonically spelled as E major, is much more impassioned, and the long bridge section that returns the music to A includes motives drawn from both themes and a brief, magical-sounding false recap in G major, G minor. One of the most remarkable features of this movement is the great expansion that takes place during the reprise, including a second complete statement of couplet 1, its components reassigned, and a long, soulful coda that includes theme B material. Be sure to notice the viola's penultimate note, an F flat that is unfortunately difficult to hear in this recording. That half-step resolution into the final chord will be revisited in a much more forceful way at the ending of the movement that will follow this one. Things turn quite serious now, and they'll mostly stay that way to the end of the composition. The C minor scherzo movement is constructed along traditional da capo lines, although its first submovement is another excellent example of sonata form in miniature, and my analysis will reflect this. There are three short themes in that submovement: a sinister sounding tune that rises through the submediant chord in bar line obscuring syncopations, a simple duple time subsidiary theme that I have identified as theme 1B, but which, doing little more than prolong the dominant, also serves as transition, and a bright Schumann-esque C major march tune whose half cadence is extended with an augmented sixth focus. An apparent exposition repeat soon goes off the harmonic rails and ends up in an E-flat minor development section that consists of a rigorous double fugue, some of whose answers are tonal, that is, adjusted in some way. During the recapitulation, the themes are presented in reverse order, and here's the most amazing thing of all about this movement in my view, in reverse tonality as regards theme 2. That is, this theme, which was set in C major during the exposition, comes back in E-flat major. That's the very reverse of the expected sonata form harmonic treatment of minor key movements, in which theme 2 is presented in the relative major during the exposition and the parallel major during the recap. When the first theme does come back, it is considerably expanded. First, by working out its first part so that it ends definitively for a change, and second, by crafting a C minor coda of almost unimaginable fierceness out of simple duple time material that initially served little more than a modest transitional function. The scherzo submovement comes to a close in Neapolitan-enriched C major, a tonic major ending to a minor key movement. The contrasting trio is set in the parallel key, and the aesthetic relief it affords the listener after that absolutely enervating scherzo is for me one of the great experiences that one can have in engaged listening. I believe this music, which just mounts and mounts, speaks very well for itself, and I trust my running commentary will be sufficient to guide you through its formal unfolding. The scherzo is brought back in its entirety and ends as before. With that ending in mind, I want to draw what I think is an appropriate parallel to the final movement of Franz Schubert's chamber music masterpiece, the C major Quintet for strings. That movement, like this one, begins in C minor, harmonically off-center. And like this one, it closes in C major, but its penultimate note, sounded in both cases by all the bowed strings, is a D-flat, a borrowing from the darkest mode of all, the Phrygian, to serve as root of the Neapolitan chord. In both cases, this closing gesture sounds to me like one of defiance, the shaking of a clenched musical fist. The final movement is a great three-part complex in which a slow introduction reminiscent of some of Beethoven's late quartets and a multi-part coda that includes a virtual second development section frame a nimble sonata-form movement of high seriousness. The return to the F minor tonic is announced immediately by the cello, whose rising octave plus half-step motive is imitated by each of the other voices, gradually growing in urgency and finally flowering out into a full-throated lament over a throbbing heartbeat accompaniment in the piano. This introduction hints at high drama, and the character of the main theme then, a folk-like Hungarian-flavored tune whose phrasing runs from mid-bar to mid-bar, comes as something of a surprise at first hearing. But the onset of the transition makes it perfectly clear that this movement's intent is serious, and its contrapuntal bent is then shared by the first member of the second group, a C minor theme held constantly off harmonic center. This unsettling chromatic counterpoint is surely not far from the world of Arnold Schoenberg, as careful listeners to both artists understand. The remainder of this C minor area bristles with prickly counterpoint that includes motivic references to the movement's introduction, with the exposition's closing bordering on savage. The development section into which that closing suddenly relaxes is a transformed statement of the main theme in C minor. This transformation is one of many one encounters in Brahms where an ornate melody is shorn of its ornaments to reveal its voice-led skeleton. I have occasionally referred to such variants as Schenkerian. Without much ado, the music simply returns to F minor for the recapitulatory statement of the main theme. The continuation of that theme is greatly expanded, which seems to reflect back on what happened in movement 2. The music manages to modulate into the submediant, D-flat major, for a glorious working out that includes another of those beautiful half-step relaxations like the one we encountered in the corresponding portion of movement 1. A multi-part coda almost 3 minutes long brings this tour de force to an end. Its first part is yet another transformation of the main theme, this one solemn, a character no one would think to ascribe to the theme in either of its earlier guises. An apparent consequent phrase soon leaves the established harmonic path and heads for the minor submediant, the almost unimaginably dark key of D-flat minor. That's to set up the last part of the coda, which begins in the enharmonic respelling of C-sharp minor, with the final transformation of the movement's main theme, now in 6/8 time, the spirit of the scherzo returned. If you'll notice the little descending scale-wise motive 3-2-1 that begins this passage, you'll see it everywhere, and the movement ends with it. This is also the motive that begins the E-flat minor portion of the second theme of the same composer's first symphony in C minor, a composition he was working on at the time. I don't think I need to say anything more about this coda. It's absolutely hair-raising, the most effective ending I can imagine to a masterpiece that leaves me thrilled, shaken, and exhausted every time I listen to it.